Good morning, it's Friday the 3rd of November here in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Sam Bankman-Fried is found guilty, the founder of FTX, convicted of massive fraud over the crypto exchange's collapse.
Gaza City encircled. Israel's military offensive continues as the US Secretary of State meets with Benjamin Netanyahu today.
BOE blues, traders bet on UK rate cuts after a bleak outlook from Andrew Bailey.
Let's begin with a roundup of our top stories. Sam Bankman-Fried has been found guilty of fraud and conspiracy. It took jurors less than 5 hours to convict him on all 7 charges relating to the collapse of the crypto exchange FTX. Prosecutors said that Bankman-Fried directed the transfer of FTX customer money into an affiliated hedge fund, Alameda Research, for other investments. Bloomberg's legal reporter Ava Benny-Morrison was in the courtroom to see Bankman-Fried's reaction.
He was pretty emotionless. He was asked to stand up by the judge when the jury delivered its verdict. He faced the jury box. He held his hands in front of him, and it looked like he was staring down at the floor as the foreperson for the jury confirmed guilty to each of the 7 charges. He then sat back down. When the jury walked out of the room, he was whispering with his lawyers. He was nodding a lot. While he wasn't very emotional, his parents were. They were holding each other. His dad doubled over at one point.
That was Ava Benny-Morrison, Bloomberg's legal reporter, speaking. Well, Sam Bankman-Fried will be sentenced in March and could face a maximum sentence of 110 years in prison. His lawyer says he will consider an appeal.
During the trial, prosecutors characterised Bankman-Fried as the mastermind of a scheme designed to make him, quote, the king of crypto. Bloomberg Businessweek's investigative reporter Zeke Foe wrote a book on FTX's crypto roller coaster. He told us Bankman-Fried struggled under cross-examination.
When his own lawyer was questioning him, he had a lot to say. But when the prosecution had their turn to cross-examine, he suddenly didn't remember anything. And in one moment that was dramatic, especially for me, the prosecutor asked him about the statement, there was more leeway. And he said, I don't remember saying anything like that. She whipped out a copy of my book, Number Go Up, and walked it over to him, like a hard copy, and was like, turn to page 224.
Foe added that the conviction is the first in a wave of legal action against crypto companies. The sector now faces questions over its future and if the verdict is a reflection on the wider industry.
Now, the Israeli military says that a ceasefire is, quote, not on the table ahead of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to the Middle East.
Israeli troops encircled the north of the Gaza Strip as the death toll mounted. Blinken told reporters he wants to talk to Israel about better protecting civilians.
We're determined that this conflict not spread, and we'll be talking to both the Israeli government and partners in the region about what all of us are doing to prevent that from happening.
The trip by America's top diplomat comes as House Republicans passed an Israel-only aid bill. President Biden has vowed to veto any aid plan that leaves off Ukraine.
Apple has warned that revenue in the holiday quarter, usually its biggest of the year, will be about the same as last year. Wall Street had projected about 5% growth. The company's been trying to pull out of its longest sales slowdown in decades, including a deceleration in China. Principal analyst at Lopez Research, Maribel Lopez, says that there's no silver bullet.
We do have Huawei coming on as competition. We do have a general slowdown in smartphone sales globally, as we've seen also with the PC Mac business. And then we have some pricing effects, right? So when you put all these together with the currency, a slowdown in some of the consumer spending, and a competitive environment, it's hard to point to any one specific thing that makes it difficult for Apple. They're actually facing multiple challenges at the same time.
Lopez Research's Maribel Lopez there. Well, Apple reported revenue for the fourth quarter that fell to $89.5 billion, its fourth straight revenue decline. The tepid outlook also sent the stock down as much as 4.6% post-market.
The Bank of England's gloomy economic forecast has traders betting on rate cuts. 10-year gilt yields fell as much as 18 basis points after the Governor's press conference, despite rates staying unchanged at 5.25%. In an interview with Bloomberg, Governor Andrew Bailey pushed back against the market reaction.
We still see the risks to inflation as being on the upside at the moment. And it's important for that message not to get lost. If the market has taken from what we have published today a view that we are leaning towards more cuts, then I'm afraid I will lean against that.
Despite that warning, the Governor's forecast points to a flatlining economy in downgraded growth forecasts. The Bank of England now expects no growth in 2024 and acknowledged the growing hit from previous monetary tightening.
And finally, Goldman Sachs has named 608 executives to the managing director rank. That's 5% fewer than the last raft of promotions, which was announced in 2021. The title is seen as a stepping stone to the firm's highest rank of partner. Goldman has suffered in recent quarters amid a deal-making slump and a costly failed effort to expand into consumer businesses. So, a spectacular fall. It's one of our key stories this morning. Sam Bankman-Fried, who was the face of crypto, the company he founded at just 25, FTX was valued at $32 billion in early 2022. But then FTX and its affiliated hedge fund Alameda Research collapsed into bankruptcy last year. And now, after a month-long trial, he has been found guilty of 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy. Joining us now to discuss this is our crypto reporter, Siddhartha Shukla. Siddhartha, good morning. Thanks for being with us. So the jury found him guilty of these counts. What did they conclude then from these weeks of the trial? What did they find him guilty of?
Yes. So after the month-long trial, the jury members reached a unanimous verdict and found Sam Bankman-Fried guilty on all 7 counts, which included charges like wire fraud and conspiracy to commit securities fraud and money laundering. So Sam Bankman-Fried, as we all know, had directed the transfer of FTX customer money into Alameda Research, which was a hedge fund in which he owned 90% of the stake. And also the money from FTX customers was misappropriated for other risky investments, political donations, and also to purchase expensive real estate for the company and for him as well. Yeah.
Now, Sam Bankman-Fried gave evidence during this trial seen as a high-risk strategy. What was it that we heard from Sam Bankman-Fried when he spoke at this trial?
So during the course of the trial and even before that, Sam had insisted that it was the lack of proper risk hedging at Alameda that led to the collapse of FTX and Alameda, whereas during the trial we saw an overwhelming amount of evidence as well as the testimonies from his colleagues showed that the misappropriation of funds was to a great extent and it was deliberately done. So I think Sam's argument that the risk wasn't properly hedged somewhat falls short of against the evidence and testimonies that we saw during the course of the last 1 month.
Yeah. Do you think then that it tarnishes crypto overall? Because in some senses, although this is a kind of very, relatively new and a kind of a modern iteration in the financial markets, actually the trial was about kind of old-fashioned fraud. So how wide does this go in terms of tarnishing crypto?
I don't think this will tarnish crypto or the applications that are being built on crypto assets over the long term, as we have seen that after the rout of last year, crypto assets have charted a strong rally in 2023. And also what we saw last year after the entire FTX thing unraveled was that it reinforces the ideas behind applications built on crypto, that you establish trust through transparency. And we saw that after the collapse of FTX, a lot of customers had started to move their funds onto more decentralized exchanges away from centralized counterparts like FTX and Binance.
What about where we go next with this process as well. What are the next stages in the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried that we need to be watching out for?
I think we'll get more clarity on Sam's sentencing in March next year. We're definitely going to keep an eye out on that because as he's been found guilty on all 7 counts, he is expected to spend a couple of decades in prison. Also, we will have to keep an eye out on what's going to be the verdict for Caroline Ellison, Gary, and Nishad, the 3 colleagues who played a crucial role in the verdict. And all 3 of them had pleaded guilty to the crime themselves as part of a cooperation deal with the prosecutors. So we'll have to see what kind of sentencing they get as well. The criminal defense lawyers that we've spoken to till now, they suggest that all 3 of them will likely get no jail time or very little, but there's a good chance that they will be forced to return the money they made from fraud. And they'll also have to pay restitution to the victims. But we'll get more clarity on their sentencing, I think, only after March next year.
OK, Siddhartha Shukla, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Bloomberg's crypto reporter then on, as we say, that spectacular fall and the fraud trial of Sam Bankman-Fried.
Well, let's turn to the Middle East next. Israeli troops say they've encircled Gaza City, where authorities in Gaza say that more than 9,000 people have now died due to the war. That's according to Gaza's Hamas-controlled health ministry. Israel has intensified its ground offensive against Hamas there. The US Secretary of State is due to arrive in Israel this morning, and he's set to meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's get the latest now from Sylvia Westall, who's our managing editor for economy and government news in Russia, Africa and the Middle East. Sylvia, great to have you with us on the programme. What is, in terms of the situation in Gaza, UN Special Rapporteur is saying that time is running out to prevent genocide and humanitarian catastrophe. This as the fighting is getting worse. What do we know about what's happening in Gaza this morning?
Well, overnight, ground operations from the Israeli military continued in northern Gaza and around Gaza City. The military said it encircled Gaza City, which it says is the main base for Hamas in Gaza. And there's been intense bombardment overnight. That's also according to the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They do daily updates. They said that in a roughly 24-hour period, 256 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, and that bringing you up to that toll that you mentioned earlier from the authorities in Gaza, which is run by Hamas. And then we had 2 Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza on Thursday, and that brings the total number of soldiers killed since the start of ground operations up to 17. In terms of the situation, it's a besieged territory. The UN has warned about the difficulty of moving people from hospitals and other facilities, and that's going to be something that's high on the agenda, the humanitarian situation, high on the agenda for Antony Blinken as he arrives in Israel shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think that Blinken can say to Netanyahu? What do you think is going to perhaps emerge from those meetings? I mean, we know that Blinken was in Israel and the Middle East on, a shuttle diplomacy mission only a few weeks ago. Now he returns. What might we expect from that meeting? Will there be another press conference, let's say?
Well, I think the message that the US has been emphasising, it's sort of in more detail, and the broader idea is they've been wanting to see what they term as a humanitarian pause. So they haven't been using the word ceasefire, but the idea would be to have a pause in fighting to make sure more medical evacuations can happen, as well as seeing if the hostages that are held by Hamas in Gaza, the remaining hostages, can be freed. There's been a trickle of people, a very small number of people that have been allowed to leave. So that's something that Biden has talked about ahead of this visit, and we would expect that Blinken would also bring this up. And, it goes along with this broader theme of when Blinken was in Israel last time, that Israel has the right to defend itself, but how Israel does this matters. So it will be going deeper into that now that the ground operations have started in Gaza.
Sylvia, thinking about the more regional view on this as well, there's been continued exchange of fire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon as well. How is the situation playing out on Israel's northern border?
That's right. I mean, something that everyone is watching very closely is this northern border and whether the conflict is really spilling over into other parts of the Middle East. For some people, it started already. The spillover's already started to happen. It has been quite intense. I think today people will be looking quite closely to the expected speech by the leader of Hezbollah, who is expected to speak in the afternoon Beirut time today, for a sense of where of how Hezbollah might be taking this forward, and that's happening later on today. And they'll be looking for clues in terms of what that means for the spread of the conflict or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Former US National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster speaking to Bloomberg only yesterday, talking about it being a regional war already. A last thought, though, then, on what the discussion might be about how Gaza is actually run after the war. Is there any significant thinking about that, briefly, Sylvia?
I mean, we reported earlier this week that the US and Israel are exploring options for the future of the Gaza Strip. That includes potentially the possibility of a multinational force that may involve American troops if Israeli forces succeed in ousting Hamas. But, these are very much theoretical conversations, and the emphasis right now really is on what's happening on the ground. And, among people that, were discussing these plans, many are very skeptical about whether anything like this could possibly happen. But there are starting to be fledgling ideas and discussions about what could happen next. I think in the region itself, the view is that, the only real solution for this conflict is the original solution, which is a two-state solution. But that's, it's a very difficult time right now. So I think that's what people are looking for right now.
OK, Sylvia Westall, thank you so much. Our managing editor for economy and government news in Russia, Africa and the Middle East.
OK, let's turn our attention to the Bank of England, which kept interest rates unchanged for a second consecutive meeting yesterday at 5.25%, so in line with expectations. The Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey, though, has pushed back against the market's reaction as he warned traders that it's much too early to be thinking about interest rate cuts. He's been speaking to Bloomberg's Guy Johnson about the central bank's decision to keep its benchmark on hold.
Well, the message we're giving is that we have, our job is to get inflation down to the 2% target. Now, we've made a lot of progress this year, and I believe we'll make more progress in the rest of this year, but we've still got a long way to go. So, our very clear message is we think the policy is having a restrictive effect at the moment, but I'm afraid we're going to have to maintain this stance for what we describe as an extended period of time.
Yeah. What is an extended period of time? Is that a year? Is that 6 months? How do you? We don't know. How do you make that language work?
What I described, we described in the report is really we took two approaches. One is to take the market curve, as it was a week or so ago, and that delivers inflation coming back to target, broadly on the sort of 2-year horizon. We also took a constant rate path, just maintaining it throughout the next 3 years at the current rate. Brings it back a little bit quicker, but there's not much between them. So the key point here is, we're going to have to maintain this stance to be absolutely assured that inflation is coming back to 2%.
The point in there is, though, that the market forecast, which does have cuts priced into it, albeit it was a week ago and there was only one of them, it does have a cut price in, and that gets you to a situation where you've got inflation basically back down to targets within 2 years. It significantly reduces the risk of a recession. Isn't that therefore the most probable outcome when it comes to the interest rate path, i.e. at least pricing in one cut during that horizon?
Actually, neither of those two paths had a recession in them. What they both have is very subdued growth. That's because at the point when we did this,
but a reduced risk of a recession.
Well, I mean, they are slightly reduced. There was only about 25 basis points difference between the two paths if you average it out over 3 years. So there's not much between these paths. And that supports the story that we're saying, which is, look, we're going to have to maintain this stance for an extended period to ensure
why
we get to 2%.
Why have you felt, though, today that you've needed to reiterate that so strongly? The language is a little bit more hawkish.
Well, I think for two reasons. One is because we still see the risks to inflation as being on the upside at the moment. And it's important for that message not to get lost. And there are several reasons why we think the risks are on the upside, but they are still on the upside. Secondly, if you don't mind me saying so, because everybody's started to ask the question about cuts. So in a way, I think we have to sort of lean against that and say, no, we've got to maintain restrictive policies.
Okay. Let's come back to that. Everybody started to talk about cuts. The market has started to price cuts. You're saying you do need to therefore lean in on that? Well,
I'm not leaning against the curve that we used when we did the forecast, because frankly there wasn't a lot of difference between those two views, the constant throughout and the market then.
But any more than that? Would you want to lean in on that?
Well, what I'm going to say is this. If the market has taken from what we have published today a view that we are leaning towards more cuts, then I'm afraid I will lean against that, yes.
In terms of the other message that you may be giving today, and that may be a broader message, inflation expectations have probably become more de-anchored here than maybe elsewhere. Is there therefore a need to reiterate that restrictive policy will be with us for longer in order to make sure that policy does re-anchor policy back to where you would like it to be? Do you need to make that message crystal clear at this point?
I don't think that inflation expectations have become more de-anchored here, actually. I think all major central banks have had pretty similar experiences. And I think we're all having to give variants of these messages because, frankly, yes, we've got to see inflation come down. And there is you're right in highlighting that there's an important link, obviously, between today's inflation, the expectations that people form, and therefore what inflation is going to be in the future. So it's an important...
Is the pain worth the gain? Is that another? But do you need to reiterate that side of things as well? That yes, we're going to have restrictive policy. We are going to re-anchor policy, but it's going to be worth it.
Well, I do strongly believe that because I do say often, and it's important to say it, that of course if we continue in a situation where inflation is above target, then that's going to be a worse outcome.
Do you think we are heading for an environment where rates are higher for longer? Let's talk a little bit about the curve. I know you don't want to lean on the curve, but let's talk about the curve. The curve certainly since the last meeting has steepened significantly at the long end. Got a bear steepening. Long end rates have come up, curve's flat as a pancake. Why do you think that is, firstly? Jay Powell's talked about term premium, there's deficit pricing going in there. You talked in the introduction about maybe a higher R-star neutral rate. It could be stickier inflation. Firstly, why do you think that has happened? What message is the long end of the curve sending?
I think there's one or two things that we're picking up from there. I do think that the higher for longer message has been absorbed over this period that you're describing. So you go back to the summer, I think it's a fair point to sort of start. I do think that the market has absorbed this from central banks in the plural has absorbed this message and it's got reflected in curves. I think there's a term premium element as well, as you rightly say. What I would say there is that there is a very large, what I would call sort of global element to that.
Sure.
And interestingly, I think if you look at the UK and the euro area together in terms of curve movements, pretty similar sorts of numbers. US, though, quite a lot bigger.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.